Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at this concept by Peter Zakaris. Peter, I hope that I'm saying your name right. And he's asked us to take a look into, well, what I would change if I was concepting this, if I was sculpting it, if I was supervising it, whatever it is. And before I do that, what I want to do briefly is just take a look at, this is the reference board that he's created for it. And there are some thoughts that I have here which are not going to be in sync with what necessarily everyone else would say, so take it for the value that you see in it. But if I was doing this or if I was supervising this, I would say no to going anywhere near what anyone else has ever done, right, for in terms of mythological creatures, in terms of similar things, because the danger is that you start to chase these, and rather than chasing, like, let's say that you really like these images, which I guess you do, they're why they're in there, but the problem is that then you chase that artist or you chase the work done by that artist, whereas the process of creating a thing should be the meeting point between you and nature, and the end result of that needs to be as pure as you can get it, and other artists' work will contaminate it. So you get inspired by other artists, you look at other artists, you do all of that stuff. Of course, I'm not saying not to do that, but when it comes to your own work, you don't allow it to get into the mix. For the last however many months, it feels like forever now, we've been making a lot of robots for Netflix, and at one point one of my artists was asking, well, can I want to look at Ghost in the Shell. I really like the way that they did the I think it was the Rust work or something, and well, you know, I'm not too much of a hard ass. I said yes, but what I thought was no, no, absolutely not. You may not do that, because it's someone else's interpretation of that natural phenomenon. And if you want to know how to represent the natural phenomenon, you go to nature for it. So, this is my first step: is to disregard anything I've ever done or anyone else has ever done, because I need to know this thing. What is the thing that makes this thing what it is? What is the DNA of it? How did it get to be that way? How does it live? How does it breathe? How does it sleep? And I can't allow any contamination in that. And that sounds like artistic mumbo jumbo, but it's very, very important in creating anything. So that's my starting point for the reference for this is, well, you know, does it have to have horns, for example? I'm catching myself there because what I was going to say is, you know, then I would look to horned animals, for example. But the only reason why I've assumed that it should have horns is because I have the contamination with our preconception of this mythological creature, because we've been fed that image by 1,000 artists 1,000 different times. But it doesn't have to have horns, you know, it's certainly not established that it has 4 eyes, so you're already going, being creative with your interpretation. So my starting off point with this would be to go, what is it that defines this thing? What is it that makes it the thing that it is? And assuming one of the points of definition is that it is a minotaur, they will have, and this is up to you to decide, what is it that makes it a minotaur? What can it not do without that, you know, what is the border there? If it didn't have hooves, would it still be a minotaur? If it didn't have horns, would it still be a minotaur? And again, this isn't just mumbo jumbo. You're defining the brief, you're defining the scope of what it is that you can do and what it is that you should do, because then once you have that, once you have those basic rules, you can go away and just start to work with shapes and start to work with forms. And from that, you will then learn, does it have horns, does it have hooves, whatever it is. Or, well, you'd already know that from the rules that you've set up, but I mean, like, so let's say that it has to have horns and it has to have hooves, right? Let's say those are 2 of our rules. Well, then you can work with the size of them, with the amount of them. You know, it could have however many horns through there, it could have, you know, a whole row of them on either side, whatever it is. You then start to work with that, and you probably work with that in 2D because it's going to be faster to iterate on. And then when you start to feel the emotional connection with the thing, when you start to understand what it is, then you can start to bring it into the real world. And then let's say we've ended up on going, okay, yeah, the thing that we want has horns that are that size. Then of course, then I go to nature and I go, what has horns that are that size? What are they made of? What is the visual pattern of that? But even then, you know, as I'm looking at whatever it is that I'm looking at, let's say it's a bison or something, then I will look at the horns that has, but those are bison's horns. They're not the horns of my specific creature, so I'm not necessarily going to match them exactly. So everything always comes down to the how to say it, I guess, looking for describing your character in the purest way possible, something like that. And that feeds into everything. That's not just something that I'm saying now, and then I'm going to go on to talk about, the actual stuff that matters. That's all that matters. So, for example, as I'm trying to work out the eyes through here, the quality of the sculpting of the eye doesn't matter. Now, in this case, the quality looks great, looks very nicely sculpted, but the thing that I have to answer first is, why does it have the 4 eyes? And if the answer is because it looks cool, that's not going to work. I mean, it's going to work okay, but people might respond to it, but it's ultimately a superficial path to be following. And it's not a difficult question for me to answer. I can go like, okay, well, maybe some of these eyes, maybe these eyes operate like normal, and it looks like they're forward-facing eyes, like on a human, like on a predator. And then potentially these eyes are a completely different set of eyes for a different reason, like it's for low light levels or something like that. In which case, how do I respond to that? Maybe they need to be much bigger for it to work. And in this way, like, it's not that my audience is going to look at that and go, wow, that's clever. Those are the low light level eyes, right? Unless that's a beat in the script or something like that. I don't need to worry about hitting that. But what it means is that I then have a motivating impulse for every single brushstroke that I make. And if I'm supervising the concept, then I can then take that all the way through. So I can say to the animators, like, look, no, when he's tracking what people are looking at, he's using those. Or when he's doing it when the light levels are up, and when they're down, he's using those, or something like that. And again, the audience isn't going to read on that, but what's going to happen is you're going to stitch the DNA of the entire character through the entire team. It's very rare that happens. Normally just the character gets kicked down the pipeline, and each time, like, it's, the concept guy does something and he doesn't speak to the modeler, and the modeler does something, doesn't speak to the rigger, and the rigger doesn't speak to the animators. But that's an imperfect end result, even though it's a very common end result. But from the point of view of doing the concept and doing the model, know the intention behind every single brushstroke that you're going to do, because it's ultimately going to allow you to create the effect of something that exists in a real world, whether it's our real world or otherwise. So for me, within what I've just said, that kind of, it covers everything. It covers like the decisions that you're going to make on the armor, both in terms of the design of it and in terms of the wear of it, because it's the same thing. What is the story of this? Who designed it? Why? What are the materials made out of? How do those materials act to wear and tear? These questions, the questions that you ask, will be your motivating impulse behind every single thing. But I suspect that what you want is for me to suggest changes rather than go deep into the philosophy of it. Fine, okay, fine, I'll do that. So let's say I want this guy to feel powerful and strong, right? The proportional rules that you want to consider when working with strength and power is, well, I don't know if there are rules, but the way that I teach it is I look at the difference between an infant and an adult male, because that transition, the things that change, are the things that give the adult male power as opposed to the infant. And the changes are the length in the legs predominantly. So the legs will grow at a faster rate to the rest of the body, and then through puberty the shoulders will then widen, and the head itself will grow the least, right? Meaning that remains relatively static, and therefore when the whole of the rest of the body grows, the head is small in comparison with the rest of the body. So what this means is that if you want something to feel strong and masculine, you go, okay, lengthen the shoulders, lengthen the legs, smallness of the head. Just these three things are going to work fine. Now, as I say this, I am going to loop back to your reference just to show you how these artists have not followed that rule to create a different feeling. You see how the legs are short here, and that creates, certainly in this one on the right, which is the stronger concept, I would say, or carries more character with it potentially. By keeping the legs short, but having the shoulders broad and the head relatively small, we don't necessarily sacrifice the feeling of power but we do sacrifice elegance, and there you go. There's a useful rule for the legs as well. The longer you make the legs, the more elegant it's going to feel. If you look at any illustration of what am I looking for? Fashion illustration, you'll always see just like, you know, legs for miles sort of thing, because it's going to give you this feeling of elegance. In this case, up to you however you want to play it. It's your guy, your rules. But let's just look at broadening the shoulders. Now, as I do that, there's an anatomical nuance that I'm going to point out, which is that you see how this line continues unbroken from the trapezius through to the deltoid. That's what I call slopey shoulder syndrome. And it doesn't really exist in anyone, because you have the clavicle through here and the scapula back there, and they create like, it's like a shelf, like a bony shelf running through the body here. So regardless of people big or small or whatever, you're always going to have the break through there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to broaden him through the shoulders, but I'm also going to reduce the slopey shoulder syndrome. So here, as the trapezius bunches up, I'm going to be affecting the armor on that side, and I don't really care. But yeah, you see this break through here, that's coming from the bone, and it's important. Broad rib cage as well. Like, another thing, if you want to look at power, is as well as looking into what happens through the lifespan of a person, or the period of growth, let's say, the 3 points I mentioned, the length of the legs, the width of the shoulders, and the shape of the head. You can also look at the differences between male and female, and the most obvious ones are in the rib cage and hips. So men have a wider rib cage and narrower hips, and in women that's inverted, of course. That's where you get that pear shape, thin rib cage, wide hips. So you want the feeling of strength, you push towards that masculine trait. You can make the rib cage as wide as you want and the hips as narrow as you want. You look at Frazetta and his rib cages, and they're just like exploding out of the chests. Now, as I'm doing all of this, I'm certainly going to shrink the head down, because if I don't, he does risk feeling kind of dumpy. Okay, something like this. Scale that down. Basically, the smaller you make that, the more heroic he's going to feel. And I would always suggest, like with any change that you're making, just, you know, see what the tipping point is. See when it gets to the point where it's like, that's ridiculous. But that point might be okay, actually. You know, if you just bite down and play it completely straight, like something like this, you can potentially get away with it. But you at least need to know where that line is. Say something there. Let's go back to potentially something like that. He's leaning a little bit with his groin. It works fine as a stance. Again, you need to know the character of the guy, because yeah, if he is more of a clumsy sort of guy, then, well, it wouldn't be clumsy. Clumsy, I'd have a big forward stoop. But you know, some people will lead with their groins, but it's a little bit old manish. Generally here, I just want to make sure the head is more or less over the feet through there. But if he's stooping, I can allow him to push forwards, but I need to counterbalance that and bring some weight back the other way. So I need to know where his center of balance is, and wherever I decide that to be, I need about half the weight in front and about half the weight behind. Because if you have more of that in front or behind, then he's going to start tipping, and it's going to feel unnatural, because he's going to need to be using strength to just even stand, you know, which is not going to feel like a naturalistic stance. So if here we switch, bonk, there's the difference. And then through here, maybe he's getting too broad in the shoulders. Yeah, there's something, as I'm moving towards this, I feel like what I'm doing now is pushing it towards something that's a little bit generic, and what you had in yours with the slopey shoulders and the big head is something that feels less generic. So this is opening up another can of worms that I might have to contend with. From the side, I certainly don't feel that it's generic. So potentially what I'm going to do is rein in that wide rib cage a little bit and just allow him to get broad through there. So it's not just like a, you know, he doesn't want to feel like a cookie cutter superhero kind of physique, I don't think. So here, and then pushing his shoulders up to just give him a little bit more of a stoop. Yeah, something like that could work. So anyway, we can of course play with this until the cows come home. That was not an intentional pun, but I'm going to move on just to talk about a couple of anatomical nuances. The main thing is, I think, two things. One is the way you're representing bone can be sharper. I notice it certainly here as it impacts the silhouette of the hands. You see, if I switch to a silhouette there, you're getting that I can easily see as one long curve through there, and I want to break that to really feel the structure of the bone underneath. So bang, I'm just going to look to break that, reduce the curvature of the hand. It's really common that people will accidentally make too much of a curvature in the hand, but even on very fatty, meaty hands, you're actually not going to get that so much. So there, it's just allowing that to break, and in doing that, I'm just reinforcing, how do I describe bone? What is the quality of bone? If I say that it's sharp, then all I need to do is go over all of the bony areas, let's say here, and go, okay, how do I define that? So it doesn't need to be accurate, because this is, you know, a mythological creature, but, you know, I'm just finding some sharp planes and things like that, and I'm just making sure that it doesn't feel like this, because this is muscle, right? Or it doesn't feel like this, because this is tendon, or it doesn't feel like some fatty area. I'm not sure if you have any fatty areas, but potentially you should, like protecting the knee through there, for example. But yeah, so I think you could really do a pass going over where is the bone and how do you define the visual language of the bone. And both on quadrupeds and bipeds, the knees are going to be bony areas. Just the joints in general will be bony. So through here, through there, and it's not just going to be that, right? This would be the, on a human, this would be the back of the foot, the calcaneus, but it's also going to be, you know, whatever. It doesn't matter, the accuracy of it. And the accuracy of the anatomy never, ever matters, but the storytelling elements do. And so here I'm saying that's bone, it's a different bone. It doesn't exist on a human, that bone necessarily, or on an animal, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, I've decided that it's bone, and I'm just looking to tell the story of that. Right, so now suddenly this is different to that. Jesus. 17.5 minutes. All right, one other thing, and then I'm going to shut up. You see how you've divided that perfectly, boom, like a coffee bean? You don't see it in nature, right? You don't. Nature wants patterns. It tends towards patterns, but it never can, right? It tends towards order, but there's always chaos stopping it. There's always this battle between order and chaos. So then you just need to know how that pattern is broken. And you don't need to, you know, the pattern breaks in a human in a different way to how it does in a quadruped. But it doesn't really matter. Like okay, let's reference a human. Basically, this on the inside, this would be a sharper line with a tight curve underneath, and this would be long and soft through there. So these movements, although they are very similar, you know, in Spanish, they're the gemelos, the twins, but twins aren't identical, even identical twins, right? They have their own personalities, their own characteristics. You never see a repeating pattern in nature. So again, in the human, this one running down further on the inside than it does on the outside. Really doesn't matter how you play that, right? I could reverse it, and then this wouldn't be accurate to a human or a quadruped or anything, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The accuracy never, ever matters. I don't even need to make this, you know, I'm going to say this tendon is riding up through the middle there. It's not how the muscle acts in any creature that exists on this planet, but it doesn't matter because this is a made-up one. And even when you're dealing with realism, the accuracy is always far behind the storytelling when it comes to prioritizing. So, but you can just have this thought, you can go over the entire sculpt and just go, do I have symmetrical forms? And if you do, just take a gun to their head and shoot them. You can't have symmetry in nature, but you can push towards it. If you go too far the other way, everything's going to be chaotic and it's not going to feel natural. And just with that idea, that's kind of everything that you need to know about studying nature. Really, just finding that balance between order and chaos. I'm going to shut up in 1 second. The other thing that I want to talk about here is that he's being built in a T-pose, and if you meet a person in real life, the impression that you will get of that person will be from 1,000 little things. From the way their hair is, to the way they smile, to the way they stand, and that all of those things will add up to that person's character. And so when you're working a concept, you do yourself a massive disservice by building it in this pose. Again, by saying that, I will go against what other modeling supervisors might say, because of course this is the pose you might want to rig it in, but it's not giving you anything of the character of the guy. So I think as soon as is humanly possible, you move towards that, because you got to find the character of him first. And when you know the character of him, well, then it's an easy build, right? Then you're just filling in the dots, or connecting the dots. The very painful thing is the process of finding his character. Anyway, Peter, I will leave it there, but hopefully that's useful.